All right, you guys, thank you so much for joining us today. So we're talking all things analytics in this panel. We have a really good team of experts for you. So right here next to me is Paul Quigley, who's CEO of NewsWhip, which I'm sure most of you, if not all of you, use. And then next to him is Alana Coates, who's engagement editor at the FT, and finally Sarah Nasser, executive producer at AJ Plus. And they're all going to be talking to you a little bit about how they personally use analytics. And then we'll kind of go into questions from you guys. I think we want to talk a little bit about kind of, we have, the blessing and the curse of analytics, right? They all get completely thrown at you. And so how do you separate the noise from what actually matters? How do you use them to drive editorial decisions? And how do you stop your newsrooms getting completely overwhelmed by them? So they're each going to give a super quick, 3-minute presentation, and then we'll go into discussion. So if you guys have any questions, get your questions ready. And Facebook Live audience too, obviously we will be throwing to you for some questions too. So Sarah, do you want to kick us off?
Sure. Hi, everyone. So I think as a digital news organization, everyone who works in one or who runs one thinks about how to build a loyal and engaged audience, how to build one as well as grow one. And obviously, thinking about that, especially in a changing media environment. And analytics are really crucial to that. YouTube analytics, Facebook insights, so on and so forth. But I think in order to really use data to its fullest potential, you really need to think about your organization's editorial objectives. And so, at least at AJ Plus, one of the things that, one of the missions that really underpins how we move forward, or Al Jazeera's mission as a whole, is looking at how we can rebalance the media landscape by respecting the diversity of our humanity. And that sounds really lofty, but I think that really shines when you think about the type of stories that we cover. Basically, we take a look at underrepresented and minority groups and provide a counter-narrative, an alternative to what long-standing legacy media organizations have put forth. Now, thinking about that, we need to take a look at basically the type of analytics that help us ensure that we're reaching this audience as best as we can. And engagement and watch time are two key analytics that we focus on. Engagement obviously means a lot of things to different people on various platforms. And I would say that shares have been really crucial in figuring out the type of stories that we commission as well as focusing on. And watch time helps us figure out how to ensure that we deliver quality content to our audience, as well as grow our audience, because what our numbers have shown is that 50% of our audience, if they've reached the 80% mark on watch time, will come back for future stories. So that's been really key in the type of stories that we focus on. But one thing that I would like to also mention is that analytics don't tell the complete story. Obviously, you need to supplement this with editorial expertise and experience. And analytics are really crucial, but obviously other things matter as well.
Great. Thank you so much. Alana. Sorry, guys, we just got to get her presentation back. There we go.
Ooh, cool.
There we go. Hi, I'm Elena. I'm from the Financial Times. What I do in my job is I work on strategies to grow our audience, and I work with other journalists and other desks editors on kind of optimization and planning, all trying to make the newsroom a little bit more audience first in their thinking and their planning. A little bit more about the FT for context of what I'm going to say. So we are we sell subscriptions. We have about over 850,000 of them at the moment. We have a paywall. It's a fairly hard paywall. You have to sign up for a trial to sample our content, and we give out 1 click free per day on social platforms and for Google. So it's quite, those are the main platforms we use to reach new audiences. But because most of our readers are signed in, we actually have quite a lot of data on the journeys that people take through our site. And if we weren't completely ruthless about what we look at, we would just be absolutely drowning in it, because we could, if we wanted to, track absolutely everything. But that's not realistic or useful to us. So what we really care about is, maybe in the newsroom at least, we're not as focused on subscriptions, and that's because the journey that a reader takes to becoming a subscriber is not exactly linear. It involves lots of sampling over a long period of time. And then when they do finally decide to subscribe, it's that one story that they read before they did the subscription is only the final part of the journey. And so we don't hold editorial accountable for our subscription numbers. Instead, our goals are all around engagement, because growing engagement is what grows subscriptions. So engagement, obviously, a lot of that is very qualitative. It's kind of, did our readers find this useful? Was it valuable to them? Did they enjoy it? Did they feel more informed? And those are really difficult things to measure. So instead, we kind of have to create proxies for that. We have to look at, did they spend some time with the stories? Did they share it? Did they comment? Do we have evidence that they actually read it? And then did they go on to read other things at the FT too? Those are the kinds of things that we're sort of generally looking at. And it's really important to set goals in order to fix that. So here's just a general view of what a journalist might see when they look at our analytics system. It was built in-house in the newsroom with a team of developers with journalists. So if you were a journalist, and this is very just average, very typical FT story, very core on, it was an unmasking of a traitor who was trying to remain secret. And so when you come to the journalist would come to this page and ask, how did my story do? We have this row of 4 metrics at the top, and so they're time on page, page views, retention rate, and scroll depth. And so they might look at this and be like, yeah, this is great, page views, time on page, all right, retention rate, maybe could have been a bit better, here's scroll depth, and look a little bit at the way that these metrics interact with each other and what they can say about how readers read the story, really. And then lower down the page will be more information about who those readers were and where they came from and stuff. But if you were a journalist, you just had a few minutes to come and see how your story did. We encourage people to look at more than one metric and look at the interactions between those different metrics to understand how the audience engaged with it. At the FT, we can be quite niche. We have a lot of sections that do well and do get really, really high traffic and really, really small traffic, and that the volume is not necessarily the indicator of how valuable it is, because actually a smaller, super engaged audience is much more valuable to us than a huge audience that just comes once and reads one story and never comes back again. So for some, we have to kind of adjust our benchmarks, really, depending on what we're trying to achieve. So this was a story. We don't have a lot of women readers. We wanted to write more about women, and we wanted it to be read by women. We wanted them to share it, and we wanted them to discuss the story so that we could then include them in our reporting in a roundup at the end. So the success measures for this series was not how many people read it and did they read it all to the end, but it was, did they comment and did they share it? And that's a completely different way of measuring than the previous example. But you have to have that conversation at the beginning, because if you don't know what your goals are, you won't be able to measure success accurately.
Great. Maybe one final point, Alana?
That's it.
That's it.
Thanks.
Great. Just getting Paul's presentation up there. All right.
Great, thanks, Rachel. So, social media metrics, blah, 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 right? Like, how many shares did my story get? Should I care? Isn't that the social team's problem in the first place? What I'm hoping to do in a few minutes is maybe convince you there's a little bit more to social media metrics and what they can do for a newsroom. At NewsWhip, we look at it differently. We track the distribution of all content online, YouTube videos, Facebook posts, Instagram pictures, articles from the FT, from AJ+, and we monitor how those are spreading, and it gives us a real-time picture of kind of what a lot of humanity is interested in today. So that's our kind of starting point. It's a little different. And I've got 3 examples of what our customers are doing with social media analytics. And what I'd really say is these are coming from our customers. They're the real geniuses at figuring out the opportunities that lie in social media metrics and in how you can do those to enhance, to grow your audience and grow your influence online. So the first is around benchmarking. What if social media metrics can give you chartbeat for everyone else? So you can look at how every other publisher is doing, and that's exactly what you can do with social media metrics. Certainly with our platform, you can look at how any other publisher is doing, and therefore you can see if we're doing well today, is a rising tide lifting all boats? Was there an algorithm change that's favoring everyone? Or are we doing something really well and really correctly? And if you're at the Washington Post are very good at this kind of benchmarking. They'll benchmark desk by desk. How is the politics desk doing versus that at the politics desk at competitor publications? Which writers are doing the best in terms of their share count? What themes are doing well? We've seen opinion pieces at the big US dailies become some of the real drivers of their share, of the sharing and the social media engagement that they get, the New York Times or Washington Post opinion pages. So, really drilling down, you can get a lot of learnings from social media metrics in a benchmarking sense. The next one is around editorial strategy. There's a danger when you just look at how your metrics are doing that you're going to end up kind of stuck just seeing, what works for me. And what you might really want to do is to look outside at the audience and see what's interesting them today. Here's an example we just pulled from UK news, and this is the share count on stories around about tax, with tax in the headline or in the tagging, or Brexit. What we can see here, looking at this very quickly, is Brexit's trending down as a topic that people are sharing content about, and people are sharing content for some reason around tax. So if you're in the newsroom and you're allocating your resources, there's something to this. Maybe everyone in the newsroom wants to write about Brexit, but we need to look at stories around tax if we're going to follow our audience's interest. And you can very quickly run queries like this if you have access to good social media analytics and figure out some directions you might want to move your publication or your editorial strategy today. Finally, and this is the real ninja stuff, is finding the white space, the opportunities that are out there each day. And this is where you need to look at what are the stories that are trending outside of my space and my competitors' spaces, maybe finding the kind of stories that Sarah is talking about that aren't being covered elsewhere, but that maybe are getting some early social signals by looking at the Facebook pages of groups that you're interested in and seeing what's bubbling up there. So that's the kind of a big important step for finding things that aren't being covered. So social media metrics isn't about chasing necessarily what's cool. If you filter down to the real specific small places, you can find things that aren't cool yet and bring them to your audience. So those are just three ways that maybe social media data can be used outside of how many people are sharing my story today, and can come into the top of the funnel on editorial and help guide decisions. Thank you.
Great. Thank you guys so much. As we go into the discussion, I think when I was talking to people about what questions they have about metrics and analytics, two kind of main themes emerged. The first one is we have access to all this crazy data, right? So how do we actually use this to drive editorial decision making? Should we be listening to our audience at every second, or are there some points, where we kind of need to make them eat their vegetables, as Anne-Marie said earlier? And then the second one is, how do you manage all of these metrics, right? Because we have a crazy amount of data at our fingertips. So how do you do this? Is it something that you should be looking at every second of every day? Should you have a different analytics team? Should it be up to each section editor? So all that kind of stuff. So I think I'll kick off by asking each of you guys, it seems like every 6 months there's a new metric du jour, right? First it was page views, then it was uniques, and now it's engagement and whatever. So what are kind of your constant ones that you always pay attention to, and what do you think are some emerging ones that we might want to look at? Let's start with you, Paul.
Well, I think, in terms of the meat and vegetables, sometimes getting the vegetables in the right format is the right way of delivering it, right? It's getting it into a capsule that people will accept. So I think looking at data that can inform you about which formats are working the best, and maybe something that's boring can be reformatted, and maybe it should be a Facebook Live video or a Vox Pop or something, or it should be an infographic. So I think looking at data and looking at what's working for other publishers can be helpful there as well. This morning, Anne-Marie Mitra mentioned failing, but it's nice if other people have already failed on a topic and you can learn from their failure rather than go out and repeat it, right? So I think looking at what other people are doing can be a very helpful thing rather than running the same experiment. And in terms of the right number, I don't know. I don't think there's any magic number. And people like newsroom, we've got this cool stuff, and then there's cool chart beat screen up as well. And I don't think we're yet at the stage where we've managed to unite all of the numbers into one place. And it's very interesting to see how the FT have drilled it down to 4 numbers. That's a nice, manageable size.
Yeah, so Sarah, Alana, if you guys were to tell everyone here, these are the couple of metrics that you guys really need to be paying attention to, what would your picks be?
Well, I think I mentioned that the goals do vary from project to project and section to section. So we do encourage people to look at sort of a more holistic view and not just 1 or 2 numbers. We do look at, volume still is important, but it just need to see how it interacts with other things as well. Some of the new metrics that we've been looking at lately are things like topics. So what topics are kind of being read on the site, and within those topics, what types of story are the ones that are connecting to people. We would just write so much about Brexit and Trump these days from every single angle, and seeing what connects with our audience and what our audience wants to know is really quite fascinating. And another thing is one of our personal sort of goals as an organization is to get more readers outside of the UK. And so in particular, our New York and our Hong Kong offices are quite keen on growing their readership in those regions. So our Hong Kong editor might specifically try to grow the Asia audience, and so he'll be looking really closely at things like geography and how that changes over time as well. So as I said, it depends on what you're trying to achieve, and then you would then go and find out which metrics would show you whether that was working or not.
I would say it differs on every platform for us. So on YouTube, watch time would be our #1 indicator if we're succeeding. On Facebook, obviously shares would be our #1 metric. But actually on Facebook, we actually have an engagement score that encapsulates watch time, shares, likes, views, people who have reached the 10-second mark, the 95% mark. So it's a pretty big formula that our platforms team has put together and provides us a nice little dashboard that we can easily access. But one thing to keep in mind is that we take this information, when we look at this data, we're also thinking about what is it that we're adding to the conversation, or what kind of conversation would we like to start. So for example, looking at today with Jared Kushner and the whole arms Saudi deal, thinking what would we add to this conversation? Well, let's see here. Maybe we can take a look at a history of US-Saudi relations since Roosevelt, and we maybe title it "Why Trump Won't Break Up with Saudi," despite all the ugly stuff that happens. Another thing with the Iranian elections today, we actually did a story that looked at why is it that Iranians come out to vote a lot more than Americans. Granted, AJ Plus looks at it from a US millennial perspective, but ultimately we're always looking at what is it that we're adding to the conversation. So combining that with metrics on things that we know have been successful for us, and
Yeah, so that's a really great segue into what I think is probably going to be the big question for this panel, which is how should metrics drive your editorial decision making? So when you guys are talking about what stories to do on a particular day, how much does metrics play into that, and how much is kind of your own editorial judgment?
I would say 50-50. So, it's a combination of what's breaking, what are the headlines of the day. So it is that editorial experience, looking at stories that have been successful and what resonates with the audience. But then it's also taking a look at the metrics and seeing what doesn't work. So, obviously something dealing with the Kardashians doesn't necessarily fit our demographic, and if we do it, it won't necessarily do well, so it's something we'd stay away from.
What about the FT?
So we've since the audience engagement team started about 2 years ago, one of the things we do is just completely bombard people with data. So we go to morning conference every day, and the first thing we do is somebody from the audience engagement team will talk a little bit about yesterday and what we learned and what that means for today and any sort of today's trends that are starting already that early. So the conversation can start quite soon in the day, having someone give some sort of data which might inform some decision making later. I mean, the editors will come to the meeting with their lists, but they might slightly tweak things based on something the way that we know their audience is interested in. I think we're now, because we've been talking about data so much and it's drilled into people's head, we do sort of know what are the things our audience we can't ignore for our audience. And the thing with the FT is that the things that kind of do well are often the things that you would expect to do well. So stories about Goldman Sachs, stories about the auditors, PwC story will just be massive like that, and that's just a very specific FT thing that we know that we have to cover and we have to keep going, and the data just proves it over and over and over. So we have to kind of give our audience what they want, and also look for opportunities to do what we do a little bit better.
And Paul, what advice would you have for publishers on kind of incorporating all this data into their editorial process?
I think what we've seen work well is separating out strategy and tactics. So strategy, we want to go after a particular audience, or we know we want to own this audience, or we're going to grow by this amount, you and cover these kinds of topics in this way. And that's looking at longer tail data. You don't want to confuse frontline people with that kind of decision every day. Once you've decided this is something we're going after, then tactically we need to make sure we're covering that base really well. We understand the audience who want to read those stories. So even at a very big, generalist publication like the AP, they're looking every day at how their stories are being used around the world, but they're not redoing their strategy every day. But periodically you need to look at the longer term data and separate out those two functions, I think is the right approach.
So one of the questions that I think a lot of people ask when it comes to analytics, when you're looking at all these numbers, how do you differentiate between content that has picked up genuine traction with your audience and content that has been prioritized? So like maybe through the Facebook algorithm, like if they're really focusing on video, a video does well, or like, because you've put it up high on the homepage, it's done really well. So how do you kind of add nuance to those numbers?
We've actually got our data science team working on this question as to sort of a normalizer. So at some point that will be integrated into our analytics system, so that you would be able to kind of put all the stories on a similar playing field. I don't know if it's that necessary. I mean, we can already see that how much traffic is coming from the homepage and how much traffic is going from search. There's a lot of opportunities to promote stories in different ways and different platforms, so that if your story doesn't get on the homepage, all is not lost, because we've got lots of other. It might be something that's better for Facebook or does better on Twitter. So there's just many different ways that people come to visit the FT stories, and it doesn't always reach the same audience on each place. So it depends.
Any other thoughts on that? All right. So another thing that I think people would really be interested to know is if we kind of have some examples of how you've really used the metrics to achieve your goals, because you guys both talked in your presentations about how important it is to have goals for the newsroom. So as you're kind of working to meet your monthly or annual goals or whatever, how are you using these metrics to kind of adjust your strategy? Do you have any success stories there, or just any examples?
Well, I think, doing frequent postmortems on your pieces, I think, at least on my team, I'm able to do that every couple of weeks. I'm looking at analytics on a daily basis, but I share those analytics with my team, and we take a look at what, has succeeded and what maybe could stand to be improved or maybe should be scrapped. One of the luxuries at AJ Plus is that we're constantly able to set time aside to innovate and try new formats out. So I'll have a producer come into my office and ask me, well, there's this story, but I'd like to try it this way. I'd like to shoot it in this particular format. And we'll give it a go. And we'll try maybe 3 or 4 versions of that. And afterward, we'll assess and see if that was successful or not, and whether or not we should continue the format. And from that, we've gotten a few formats that I've seen picked up by a lot of different outlets. One particular format, for example, is something called Perspectives. So they're basically video op-eds where you have somebody like Van Jones from CNN sit down in a chair with a black background and tell you why, the prison system needs to be reformed. Or Amy Goodman talking about the state of the media. And that came out of experimentation and looking at the numbers and seeing how the pieces have succeeded determines whether or not we continue.
I completely agree on the importance of postmortems. Definitely at the FT, things move so quickly. The news is happening so quickly all the time that there's not necessarily a culture of looking back. But the fact is, we get all these numbers, and if we don't learn from them and sort of integrate them into our work going forward, there's not really very much point looking at them at all. Like, the numbers have to be actionable. And we also run a lot of experiments. I think that's one of the key places where the metrics come in handy. Like, we will look at things like publication times. Like, for instance, we discovered that a great time to publish a story about UK politics is Sunday morning, where previously we weren't publishing anything on Sunday mornings. So looking for opportunities like that. Another one of the sort of data-driven experiments we've done was just trying to figure out how to put evergreen content onto Facebook, and we created this dashboard. So whenever a story sort of starts to organically get traffic from Facebook or from search, it will appear on the dashboard, and then a social editor will go in and choose one of those stories and repost it. And those often end up being our most popular stories on Facebook for the month, even though it was something that we originally published 6 months. It's just the dashboard allows us to find the exact right moment to go and re-promote something that's still relevant. But we run experiments all the time on things like that. Things like, what should we put up here? When's the best time to do this there? What's the best format for this? And you can't do experiments if you can't get any sort of data to measure success.
And, what I'd add there as well is sometimes, because there's so many different numbers, maybe not even looking at numbers should be the point. And what people like Newsroom, who provide the data or signals of an action that needs to be taken, where we're moving a lot of the time is to show, here's in the area of your beat, these are all the stories that are trending right now. And you can click through and see all the numbers, and you can measure and compare. But, let's give people very actionable information so they can take the next step. And I think what we'll see as well is, a little bit of AI and prediction coming in as a layer in the middle to help mediate all of these numbers and turn them into a next action for people.
Great. Well, that's a good segue into talking a little bit about the process of how we use the metrics in the newsroom. So I'm curious to know from all you guys, like on a day-to-day basis, how does this factor into your day looking at metrics? Are you looking at them hourly, more often, weekly? How does it work for you guys?
At least from my perspective, I run a team that does the explainer format, so they're the 3 to 4 minute videos that you see in your timeline. So it doesn't require me looking at the metrics on an hour-to-hour basis. It's more on the daily, once in the morning when I get in, and obviously on a weekly level, I'll share it with my team. However, my colleague who works on the team called Real Time, which are the videos that you see a lot more frequently, they're the 1 minute pieces with text on screen. She's probably looking at her metrics on the hourly. So it just depends on the format and the platform that you're on.
So same for me. I would say both. Certainly, if you're an editor working on the homepage, you're going to want to have sort of practically minute by minute data on where people are clicking and what's being read. If you're a desk editor, you might check in every now and then just to see what's being read. Myself, I sort of dip in and out depending on what project I'm working on that day. It's really interesting to go back over long periods of time, though. I think one of the most useful things we did last year was just we had very intense postmortem on the year and what people were reading over the course of the year, what topics and what drove all this engagement. And I think if you have to stop and do that every now and then just to get a big picture view and look for trends across topics too. Like we see, for instance, this massive growth in viewership for data stories. In terms of data stories were probably the best we had last year in terms of bringing new audiences to the FT. And so now we plan them a lot more strategically, and we wouldn't necessarily see those patterns unless we did these huge reviews. So the answer is essentially you have to do both short-term and long-term.
And Paul, for people who might be kind of overwhelmed by the constant barrage of metrics, what do you recommend for them to kind of keep it under control on a day-to-day basis?
I think, it has to be plugged into your existing workflow. And again, that's the challenge that comes from the data and the tech people on our side. Like what I've been really impressed was really impressed upon me is we thought people would be using Spike, our real-time trends platform, all day, every day, and some people are. But a lot of news organizations, it's still around the morning meeting. And that's a really big deal, and having very useful hard metrics. And I've had the privilege of joining the AP morning meeting, even at Spin 103 around the corner here, where there's some big decisions made for the day, or at least for the morning at that time, and there's certain metrics you need then, and then maybe you need little nudges and little suggestions over the course of the rest of the day. But having a good stack of data at times that fits into existing newsroom workflow is the right way to approach it.
Okay. I will add also, every day in our morning meeting we do exactly that. We actually go through the metrics, the numbers of not only our most successful videos, maybe our poorest performing videos, but also our competitors. So I think that's really important.
And so last question from me before we toss it to our audience here and the Facebook Live viewers. What do you think is the best way for newsrooms to kind of formalize this process of using metrics in your editorial decisions? Should this be something that has a dedicated research team or audience development team? Should this fall on each section editor? Is there the sales team needs to be involved? What would you guys recommend for kind of making sure that this gets to be part of the newsroom?
I work with this question sort of on a daily basis, and the answer is you just have to completely go at it from all sides. So when we launched Lantern last year, it was very much like seen as a self-serve platform. We wanted people to go and look for their own data and be interested in their sections and their topics and all that. And that works, but it's not enough. Like, we just need to be in every single place. We need to be on the screens. We need to go not just into the morning meeting, but anytime somebody has a planning meeting, have somebody there who can bring some data into it. And so that just creates more of a culture of remembering, oh yeah, this is important. Oh yeah, we have an audience. Oh yeah, this is what they're doing. And everyone gets it at the back of their mind, and they care, and they understand how we work, and we discuss data constantly. So you can't ignore it. We have to make it so that you can't ignore it.
I would echo that point. Talking about it in the morning meetings is really important, but I would like to de-emphasize likes, just because I feel like there's a huge allure in seeing likes, but that's not to say that your audience has actually interacted with the video, and you really do want your audience to interact, because that ultimately leads to loyalty, and then also growing your audience. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think de-emphasizing likes is something as well that we make sure it's possible, because you can get kind of false positives from those as well. But in terms of the ONA, there's a sample bias in this room. These are all the people who are going to be bringing the data and these suggestions and new workflows back to their organization. This is like the 1% of of people who are going to be open to these ideas. And from dealing with a lot of media organizations, that's who we tend to meet first, and then we try and empower them through whatever workflow, whether it's bringing data into a morning meeting, or whether it's getting people using a dashboard at least once so they start getting email alerts from it or something like that. I think it's a very human process driving change in an organization still. There's no magic silver bullet.
That's a great point to wrap up with. So from the data evangelists in the crowd, any burning questions for the panel here? Yeah.
Rachel, you asked what the next hot metric was. Just following up on that, we can see a lot of, I suppose, sentiments on, let's say, for example, Facebook video. Take Theresa May, for example, and you can see all the angry faces traveling across the screen when you're watching it. So the question is, are you guys looking at sentiment as a legitimate metric, or is it too early to actually start using that? Maybe it's something for later down the road that you can use once there's a bit more legitimate data behind it.
I would love this kind of data. I think the qualitative stuff is so important, and what we really want is that sentiment. Like, what we're doing with all these numbers is looking for that engagement, which is a very personal emotion. Practically, it's how somebody connected with our journalism, and all the numbers that we're looking at are not really answering that question. They're just kind of giving us little clues to the puzzle, and that qualitative part is another part of the puzzle. And if we can do that with some sort of data science or a technological way of adding to that, that would be fantastic. And I hope that's something that we were able to do in the future. I think integrating, like bringing actual readers into the newsroom and doing because obviously product and technology teams do this kind of UX research all the time, and some tactics like that, bringing those in the newsroom are quite interesting to do in the future. We've kind of dabbled into that, doing more surveys and doing more reactions and taking the tone of the comments and all that. But I think that's a really valuable piece of the puzzle that we don't have very well at the moment.
I would say that we're still learning a lot from it, and our platforms teams is working hard to understand the sentiment that we're finding on Facebook and YouTube. I think on YouTube it's a little bit easier because they have a very clear like to dislike ratio. And it is important, especially when we're talking about post-Trump's election and taking into consideration how we actually put together our pieces so we don't further feed the echo chamber and polarize our audiences. Sentiment is a big part of it, but we're still learning a lot from it, and yeah.
I think the emotional reactions they're solid gold for editorial discovery, for content discovery. Like, we saw users in Spike in our platform putting up, doing a search for Valentine's Day and then ranking it by the most angry reactions. So what are the stories about Valentine's Day that are making people angry? So then you're going to get some really interesting editorial angles for a different take on Valentine's Day. Or what are the stories about a brand that are really annoying people today? And there's positive emotions too. But you don't want to, if you're the FT and you write a story about Donald Trump and there's angry faces, that doesn't mean they're angry with the FT, right? It's they're angry about this story. But it can be used for attitudinal kind of targeting and content discovery very well, is what we've seen with those reactions.
Yeah, it's a tricky one, isn't it? Because the algorithms can't always pick up a sarcastic smiley face and that kind of stuff. So it definitely takes some editorial oversight to use that metric. Yeah. Oh, sorry, he's already got a mic. You first, and then you.
So you are all talking about engagement metrics, and in every conference there is talk about that. But how then you try to convince sales team in order to get those engagement metrics be applied? Because at the end of the month, it's all about ComScore and about video views and inventory, but not about those engagement metrics.
Well, for me, this just comes down to defining goals. So if I were you, if your goal is in fact sales and ads, then you're not going to look at the same things that the FT does. It's not one size fits all, and so you would definitely be looking at different things for us. For us, the reason we look at engagement stuff is just because we know that it leads to subscriptions, and that's why we're looking for engagement, not necessarily just for page views. But it's different for every organization. Every organization has slightly different business objectives and business models, and the important thing is to figure out what the question is you're asking, and then find out which metrics can answer that question, so that success looks different for every organization, I think.
And also, some of these engagement metrics can be used to benchmark. If you want to prove that, say you're the Daily Mail, you want to say, hey, we get the most engagement and content around the Golden Globes or Coronation Street or whatever topic, and you can pull in engagement data about others and tell some good stories about your brand as well, and that can help you sell the real premium advertising or even kind of brand newsroom type services for an audience too.
All right.
Hi guys, Ivor from RT. Did any of you number crunchers, and did any of you guys see any warning signs that Trump was going to win the election? and if not, why not?
We did see some. Well, we saw some. There's Trump in any given month of 2016, he was getting twice the social engagement and content around Trump was getting twice the amount of engagement as content around Clinton. And he could have said, that was negative, but if you look month on month, about 36% of the most shared stories, in the 2 months leading up to it, were from, I'd say, partisan publishers. And most people, I think, in media are in a filter bubble as well, just like the guys who read the partisan publishers are in a filter bubble. But our filter bubble didn't include Patriot News Network and, you know, True America Rules, you know, .org, and, you know, these Facebook pages have built up this big influential following, and everyone was kind of oblivious to that. And it's only when you stand back and look at the full field of data that you can see how impactful those were becoming. So that was maybe a hint that things were going to be unexpected.
The two biggest pieces of content, most popular pieces of content the FT did last year were poll trackers. So one poll tracker for Brexit and one poll tracker for the US. And both obviously did show a small chance that the result would be the way it is, but overwhelmingly these poll trackers were wrong. Brexit, I would say, was more of a surprise than the US election. I think after Brexit happened, we did kind of look and realize that we maybe had misjudged a few things. And so by the time Trump came along, we took what we learned from the way that we covered Brexit and the way that we looked at the data, and it was less of a surprise, I think, that Trump won. We've had so many elections in the UK and everywhere in Europe for the past couple of years. I feel like in terms of data, if you're working with data and you're learning from one election to another, like we just know so much about how elections work and how polls work and how readers consume elections now that it's quite a fascinating time that next time one rolls around we have a playbook which is just based on all this data that we know. So I think Brexit, all started with Brexit, and then after when we got to Trump, we were less surprised and more prepared, I guess, if that makes sense, even though our own poll tracker proved also to be wrong in the end. If that makes sense.
I think we weren't as surprised as other news organizations, but I think it has more to do with the diversity of our newsroom than it does with the metrics. I mean, we have a very, very global network, and AJ Plus as a whole is actually quite diverse as well, with people from all over the country and reporters who are on the ground. So there were inklings, there were hints that it was going to be Trump, but yeah, it was more just because of the diversity of our newsroom.
So just before we wrap up, do we have any questions from our Facebook Live audience?
We do. This question comes from Ian Hill at Tegna. He says, talking Facebook specifically, interactions and engagement seem to be going up while reach and referrals are decreasing. One possible conclusion is that people, and maybe just Americans, want to rant more, and they want to expend the effort to consume information that expands our challenge or challenges their worldview. So 2 questions. Is the panel seeing similar trends? And have you been able to use the data to create solutions to increase referrals?
Well, one possible explanation for the drop in referrals, of course, is the rise in the native content. So, you know, the extension of your brand beyond the website. So that's obviously going to lead to a drop in referrals. People are staying inside the platform with instant articles, live videos, images and text that's uploaded directly to Facebook. In terms of people using news to express their political opinion and sometimes sharing or liking without, you know, I don't know if people share much without, some stories are the headline. And I think sometimes, you know, we've got to acknowledge that, you know, Trump resigns might get retweeted without people clicking through to read it top to tail before retweeting it, right? So, you know, there's always going to be a little bit of that effect, but it is still a very strong, you know, signs of engagement on Facebook, and maybe that's why, you know, not paying attention to likes is a good way as well, because people might just react but not click.
All right, well, I think we've got to wrap it up. Thank you so much to our panel and to you guys for coming.
All right, thank you so much, panelists. Great discussion, really helpful, thank you. We'll head to the coffee break now. For those of you on site, we have DeskNet and Google Analytics that are going to hang out a little longer in the demo room. That room is zig and zag, so it's just straight down the hallway, so feel free to stop in there, and there'll be another demo session after that. Thanks.